Yes, welcome back at the studio of Copenhagen. Let's just dive into the next session. Next section will be BLOXHUB Science Talk with Harvard University. It will be moderated by Pernille Berg, also from BLOXHUB. So take it away, Pernille.
Thank you very, very much. And a huge welcome to all of you participating and watching through the Nordic Brilliant Conference. It is such a nice opportunity to be able to welcome you from the Copenhagen studio. Our topic of today's Science Talks is exactly quite relevant during these pandemic times, the importance of indoor and outdoor climate in relation to COVID-19. I am privileged. With me, all the way from Boston, I have two experts when it comes to healthy buildings, healthy cities. And it's such an honor and privilege to welcome Associate Professor Joseph Allen and Assistant Lecturer John Macomber. Welcome to you both. I know that I have been sending you so many emails about how much I've been looking forward to today. And just to break the ice, because we've never physically met, but we had such an interesting conversation in my dream last night. So for all of you attending, rest assured, Joe, John and I, we are like that. And we solved the world's issue around 2 a.m. So when I woke up this morning, I was going, this can't go wrong. But I just want, on a personal note, to say thank you to you both, because you're up early and you're eagerly awaiting the ability to have a conversation of topics I know that are not only dear to you, but are also really, really important these days. And I have done a little bit of homework, and I read this wonderful reflection. Joe was met on his first day at Harvard from one of the deans, and with the question, how will your research impact the world? And as I was reading this, I was thinking, Joe, did you predict just how much your research would become needed and pertinent and relevant in 2020? You may,
Yeah, well, so first, yeah, it's really nice to be here with you all and actually talk face to face here. And so, yeah, that was a big moment for me. It was my first day at Harvard as a new professor, and the question made me pause, and it made me realize that we have this massive responsibility. All of us have a massive responsibility. And I think that because Harvard has is such a global and strong brand, that it's an additional responsibility to say, it's not just the research to impact our community here in Boston or within the around the Harvard campus, but really to step back and think big. And what I did is I took a marker in my lab and I wrote it on our wall. How will your research impact the world? And we talk about this every week with my team. And we take our projects and take a step back all the time to say, is this really going to impact the world? And if it's not, how do we have to think bigger and bolder? What do we have to do differently? Because we're not interested in these small, this is a time for massive impact, grounded in really hard science. I think we can do the science well. I know we can, but we have to make sure it's connected to these larger conversations happening globally and around solutions.
Part of our also preparation for today, John and I had the privilege of talking during the month of July when COVID-19 in Denmark looked as if, it was all good. We weren't cruising, but we were looking good. John, being the wise man that you are, you said, listen, Pernille, we're not going to set the agenda now because this is going to, there will be so many changes and it is impossible to predict what will happen from when we had our conversation till today. I think you were right. I think I just brought with me, not for show, but currently when we're walking around, because we have so many visitors and we're so many people together, we're masking up. I will not show people some of your tweets, Joe, but you had one evening, don't know what time it was your time, it was late in Copenhagen, or early, I forget, as we're talking all the time, I've just revealed. But you had one tweet that just said, mask, 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 mask. We'll get back to that, but just to show, the mask has arrived in Copenhagen. We have wipes, special wipes that are not killing my skin that I can use as much as I feel the need for. And we have these small bottles all over the place, if you can see. So to say this is our normal today. I won't even say it's a new normal or future normal, but I think you were right, John. We could not predict when we were when we met up in July what we would face today. So one of the things that you had looked forward to this year was actually the release of your book, Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Drive Performance and Productivity. And we have arranged in our, when we've been emailing back and forwards, we've actually been talking, what will we address during the science talks? And I'm just going to list the themes and try to structure, because I have a feeling that you guys can easily start debating between yourselves. So I'm going to try and curate your conversation and butt in ever so slightly when I feel the need to. But we have 6 topics that we're going to look at today. We're going to actually look at your book, because it's a brilliant, formidable book. For those of you who have not read it or heard about it, there is such a wonderful review in the New Yorker that just really takes you through when it became pertinent and relevant to talk about buildings. I'll let you deal with the facts, the staggering facts that we are cocooning like chicken in a hen house when we look at how much time we spent indoors. So this is a very relevant topic. So that's topic number 1. We're going to dive into the science behind the book. Then we're going to address the theme that can get everyone going these days, the safe return to school and work. The third, the word aerosols. I'm just going to, the importance of aerosols. I look forward to that. Sensors, smart buildings. I'm not going to leave out our smart cities. But then we're going to get to the topic that John and I actually philosophized about when we met, was the public health, public infrastructure, and private capital. And I think this can be really interesting given the contrast between the governance structure that we have in Denmark, being such a small country, with what you are experiencing on a daily matter. So I think this is really interesting. We're going to finish off with impact investing in terms of pay for success. So we're looking into a little bit on the business model. So that's a little bit about what we're going to dive into. Practical information for those of you partaking through this wonderful Nordic platform. There is a chat function, Q&A. Feel free to comment. I'm going to once in a while look down and have a look and see if we have any questions. I have prepared a ton of questions. So again, thank you guys. Thank you to all of you watching. And let's get started. Topic number 1, your book, Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Drive Performance and Productivity. I read a little bit from the abstract and I got very curious, and I've actually also, dived into the book. I can highly recommend it. But what was the science? Can you elaborate a little bit about that? The science behind cognitive function that actually drove your book to begin with? Because there was an impetus for this book.
Yeah, sure. So John, maybe I'll start and I'll pass it off to you because the question really is about that science. The fundamental underpinning of the book is that we have become an indoor species, like it or not. We spend 90% of our time indoors. Sometimes if we were in person, I would call on somebody to ask them what their age is and to do some public math and say, well, what is your age? Multiply it by 0.9. That's your indoor age. That's how many years you've lived indoors. So I'm 45. I've spent 40 years of my life indoors. And so our team at Harvard has been doing a lot of research. So have great researchers all over the world been doing this research on indoor air quality and impacts on health. Well, one study we did, we call the COG-FX study, all around the benefits or the impacts on cognitive function, our ability to think and process information. And we found really simply that just minor improvements to indoor air quality, better ventilation, fewer chemicals, volatile organic chemicals, lower CO2, led to dramatic improvements in cognitive function performance across domains that I think everyone will instantly recognize are relevant to everyday life and also to what we're dealing with now. information seeking and usage, strategic response, crisis response, and overall strategic thinking. So this is showing us empirically that the building matters. And really the central thread of the book is building performance drives human performance, drives business performance. Okay, I had a really good handle on building performance and human performance. The human performance to business performance, well, honestly, a little hand wavy on my side. I'm a public health scientist. So this is where we knock on the door for John and recognize he's in the same boat with me, but he can really bring in he knows the building science to business science part. And so we connected and decided we had a lot to say. We thought we had a lot to say, and we decided we were going to do a couple things, one of which was write this book. Well, John, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Sure. So, Pernilla, thank you for having us. And it's really a pleasure to have a very informed moderator. We've talked to a lot of people, and it's nice to have someone who understands in great depth and an audience what's going on. I'm from industry. I spent 30 years in real estate and construction, primarily as a general contractor, and I came to Harvard Business School to teach Real Estate 101. My course now is about sustainable cities and resilient infrastructure, and in particular, I look at the so-called infrastructure finance paradox, being that there are tens of trillions with a T of US dollars in the global financial system earning almost no yield that ought to be applied into worthy projects for healthy buildings, healthy cities, schools, transit, roads, things like that. How can we make that happen? So Joe presented the cognitive function study, and I looked at this as a real estate guy, and I thought, we're missing the boat here, particularly around thinking about the building, because we're spending all this time thinking about what you can easily measure, which is largely energy, and busy making buildings tighter and tighter and tighter, which means that they are getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And some of Joe's initial work in this field was around sick buildings, which correspond almost exactly with the rise of energy efficient buildings. So I started to do some math on the cognitive function work and saw that as Joe's researchers increased carbon dioxide from 400 parts per million to 1,000 to 1,500, people really did not perform as well. We know that anecdotally. We get tired in a stuffy conference room, we get sleepy in an airplane, but we started to say, how can we apply that to the income statement of a commercial real estate tenant? So think of a typical tenant like a law firm or a consulting firm. About 50% of their income statement is in salary. About 30% might be in rent. Maybe 5% is in energy. So if they're saving 5% of 5%, that's a tiny little amount. But if you can have your payroll go a little bit farther, meaning your people have fewer sick days, then that goes straight to the bottom line. And of course, the holy grail is, can you actually help them, give them opportunity to be more productive? So if people are following the cognitive step, are performing better in the cognitive areas that Joe mentioned, that can lead to greater top.
Did you see the freeze picture, Joe, as well? We're looking into it. There is a frozen picture here. I hope that, just to recap, the interesting aspect here is basically that we have a book that's dealing with the indoor climate and connecting the health of the building and the indoor climate to productivity and performance. And I think, given
Sorry, I don't know how much I lost there.
That's okay. You're back. We can hear you and see you. It's wonderful. You were just getting, your picture froze when you were talking about the small percentage and the effect, the positive effect it can have actually by looking at enhancing the performance and the productivity by just addressing the indoor climate. And that aspect, that perspective of addressing a building has not been the case.
And making the business case for it. So I'm not sure how much you heard before, and I won't repeat it, but the idea that for a business like a law firm or consulting firm or something like that, if the people can demonstrably have a healthier space, be more productive, that makes much more of a contribution to the bottom line than whatever you might save by being cheap on the fans or not changing the filters.
I think it's because, as you're saying, anecdotally, we can all bring examples to the discussion about, okay, we got a headache or any such things. But you're also tying it into actually the aspect of creativity, well-being, and you talk about what I read and I found quite interesting was the difference in performance when we look at green buildings. I don't know if you want to elaborate, but it's just the such a small aspect of change in the building can have such a huge impact on us, the people inside the building. I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on that.
Go ahead, Joe.
I'll add a little on the science, just, because you're exactly right. I mean, and John said, we've all experienced this. It's not, sometimes I think I'm in the field of common sense, right? We know these things matter, fresh outdoor air, better lighting, but we're in the business of doing hard science and quantifying these things. We did this for cognitive function, but I'll take an element of green buildings that's really quite interesting. And we talk about in the book, this concept of biophilic design, bringing nature indoors. Now, we all know nature is good for us, right? You take a walk in the park, you feel better, clears your mind. On the field of biophilic design, we've known this is good, but it hasn't fully been quantified. So we did some studies on my team where we use virtual reality, put people in these rooms that have this elements of nature or not, and we wire them up, and we can actually measure their stress response. And if you stress them and then see, well, if I put them in a room like this, white walls, versus a room with nature and plants, and you can see their stress recovery is faster. You can see that they perform better on creativity tasks. And we can quantify this, right? So we all known this, certainly, intuitively, we've all experienced it. We can actually put some numbers towards it. And when we can put some numbers towards it, then it opens up things like John is talking about. Now we can start to quantify the benefits and make a really strong business case, right? The business community doesn't want to hear biophilic design and nature. They want to hear 12% increase in productivity for this intervention I can do in my building right now. Yeah.
So if this was a real estate audience, we'd go deeper into how these lessons apply in lending, finance, leasing, and whether they're only true in top cities in the world, like in Copenhagen or New York, with A tenants, or if they percolate through. It's not a real estate audience, so we'll leave that for another time.
But it is very interesting. And part of the other thing, talking about colloquial terms, the sick building syndrome is such a nice way of encapsulating what we've all experienced when we've been in buildings that are not performing well. So I think it's nice to hear the science behind it, so that we move from the anecdotal to the scientific argument, and and this is why I'm quite fond of your collaboration, then being able to posit the business case. If we were to, and we'll get back to the business model, because it's one of those things that I find extremely interesting. But if we were we have an audience with us virtually and also physically that are architects, they are the entrepreneurs, they are also occupants of buildings. We're all occupants of buildings, as you've just pointed out, Joe. We spend 0.9 time of our lives in a building. So it's quite, multiplied by our age. It's a lot of hours and seconds. So what would you recommend architects and entrepreneurs to think about before they construct the building, in the design, in the prospect of the building? What would be your recommendations?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and you're right. We have been in the sick building era, and our hope is that we cannot be chasing sick buildings all the time. I've done forensic investigations of sick buildings for a decade, cancer clusters, disease outbreaks. And I'm honestly quite tired of chasing these problems when we know we can design them better in the first place. So the question always is, well, what do you do? And so right in the middle of the book, the heart of the book, we have a chapter on what we call the 9 foundations of a healthy building, where we describe the evidence on things like lighting and water quality and ventilation, air quality. And in each subsection, we give tips on not just here's what the science says, like pointing out the problems, but no, here's the solution. Here's what we recommend. Here's how you should think about healthier materials. This is the target ventilation rate you should go for. You should use a MERV 13 filter or higher. So we start to get pretty granular and practical to say this is how you can do it. And it's all, again, to me and John, it's critical. It's all tied back to hard evidence that we know these things lead to better performance. And I'll let John talk about the larger framework of health performance indicators, right? This is the science. We know what to do. What do you track and how do you measure it?
So I can go into that. And also, the book talks about some of Joe's earlier research around the 9 foundations of a healthy building. So there are components that go into making a building healthy, which include ventilation, daylight, water, physical safety, noise, and aspects like that, all of which are known sort of intuitively. And of course, good designers think about this all the time. A lot of what we've talked about is how do you think about the life cycle cost benefit, particularly around how the people will perform. And the thing that we've seen lacking the most is around ventilation and filtration, because it's difficult to see the air. Like you can hear the noise, you can see the water, a lot of those things are more apparent. And by far the biggest thing that we talk about in places that have good outdoor air is increasing the indoor air. So a lot of regulatory agencies have recommendations which basically are a minimum. It's not necessarily the optimum. So we're trying to find the cost benefit for that optimum. Similarly, there are a lot of filtration things. If you think about hospitals, they're very aware of this, and most of the filters are HEPA type filters. A lot of this applies both in pre-COVID, and it certainly applies in a big way post-COVID. And the way that we feel that people should look at this is around health performance indicators. So there's, what gets measured gets done anywhere in the world. And we thought about key performance indicators. And with respect to health performance indicators, there are leading ones and lagging ones. Like a leading indicator in the building would be what's the humidity, what's the temperature set for. A lagging one in the building would be what's the actual humidity. Around the people, a leading indicator would be how are you feeling coming in today? A lagging indicator would be how many sick days have we had to pay for with our insurance company? So these indicators can be looked at in multiple ways, both pre-COVID and post-COVID. And it's kind of a combination of sensors and settings and surveys and screening and statistics, all these alliterative S's, which I'm not sure I think universities are open in Denmark. They're not generally in the United States, but like Harvard has a combination of all these things. To go into a building, you fill out a survey called Crimson Clear. I guess I feel well. You get screened. You get COVID tested a couple times a week. There are sensors for what's your temperature, what's your blood oxygenation. There are administrative controls like settings around how many people can be in the elevator, and all those things have to be balanced on a situation by situation basis for the best cost benefit for the building, both in pre-COVID times and obviously now during COVID, when the downside of being sick is so much more expensive. We wrote the book talking about a few points on the margins of productivity and health, and now you're talking about people being out of work for a month, being on a ventilator for 2 weeks. Like, that's pretty expensive. So the ability to invest upfront to avoid those later costs really changes the investment equation. And we could talk about that later in terms of paper performance.
We'll get back to that, and it's one of the very interesting aspects, because I know that you're also very, very aware of these ethical dilemmas that are pertaining to this data-driven performance indicators. But as you're also saying, John, this is one way of securing a healthy building. And it kind of goes, if it's okay with you, Joe, I'm going to move to the topic of safe return, because I think it plays such a vital role of what John has just said. And I'd like to say that universities in Denmark, they do exactly what you are doing as well. Not so much, but we did open, because there is an awareness that the students need to be together. There is a psychological dimension of well-being and health. So currently what we are experiencing is that the administrative staff is recommended to work from home as much as humanly possible, to reduce the amount of people in the buildings, to ensure safe passages, because it's exactly as in any campus. We can secure and we can monitor how many people are in a room and in an elevator, but it's the open spaces, just social spaces, that are much more difficult to monitor. We're moving along to that heated debate, because the heated debate, in my perspective, becomes so heated because it's anecdotal. And what you are actually advocating and also are able to demonstrate is the hardcore science behind it. It's the safe return to school and work. It can get anyone going these days worldwide. And there is a very heated debate in the States. Joe, I don't know how many television appearances you have partaken in at the moment. I've stopped counting. But it's not just in the States it's heated. It's also in Ireland. It's in all over Europe these days, particularly. And I know it's also going on in India. The question, it's not a dichotomous question, should we stay at home or not? Because we also at some point have to go to work or have to open the schools. So what do we do? It's the wonderful questions, who does what do we do, and how do we do it, and when do we do it? I don't know if you want to open the Pandora's box, Joe, and then we'll let John comment afterwards.
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, these are the economic crisis is a public health crisis as well. And so there are ways, we know how to keep people safe in buildings, from radiological hazards, chemical hazards, and biological hazards of all different types. The way I'll talk about offices first and then quickly touch on schools. But there's a couple things that have to happen. John and I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review back in April that describes what's called the hierarchy of controls. This is a strategy that's been used in my field for decades, the field of worker health and safety. It has 5 parts, and it touches on actually a lot of the things you just said. So this hierarchy of controls, eliminate the hazard, is number 1. That is prioritizing the administrative tasks that can be done remotely, work from home. That's not how we're going to reopen schools, universities, or the economy. 2, substitution. So bringing back just the core people. Harvard, for example, only bringing back those people that need to be physically present and some subset of the campus. 3, engineering controls. These are healthy building strategies that we've been talking about. Better ventilation, better filtration, the use of supplemental portable air cleaners with HEPA filters. 4th, administrative controls. These are things like de-densification, managing queues and flows of people, separating by 6 feet or 2 meters or more. That's a minimum. 5 is PPE, for personal protective equipment. This is universal masking. If you do all of those, you can reduce risk. There's no such thing as zero risk in anything we do, and certainly not during a pandemic. But you layer enough of these defenses on top of each other, and you can really drive down risk. That same logic applies to schools. Schools is a different scenario because there are devastating consequences to keeping this many kids out of schools. Virtual dropouts, abuse, neglect, exploitation, violence, food insecurity, inequities. This is a massive problem. It's the single biggest issue, in my opinion, we're facing right now in the US and probably around the world. How to reopen schools safely. We get a couple benefits that kids, thankfully, are less likely to get this and less likely to suffer the most severe consequences if they do get it. But to your point about the when, the what, the how, 2 conditions precedent. 2 things have to happen. 1, you have to have low community spread before you reopen. If you're a raging hotspot, you will have too many cases in your school. 2, it cannot be schools as usual. You have to put in these control strategies. You have to think about ventilation and filtration. You must do universal masking. Try to de-densify as best you can. Alter schedules. Get kids outside. Anything you can to get them back and safely. When we do all those things, we can drive down risk. Now, in terms of the how to do it, I'll give you a resource. My team, my Harvard Healthy Buildings team, put out a 60-page risk reduction strategy report on risk reduction strategies for schools. On top of that, we have put out how-to guides, how to measure ventilation in your classroom. What happens when you open up the window? How many air changes per hour should you get? What air changes per hour should you target? 20 questions every parent should ask before sending their kids back to school. A tool to select the right portable air cleaner for your classroom. The takeaway is this, right? It is critical we get kids back in school. Community spread has to be low. We have to put in these control strategies. And honestly, they're not hard, and they can be done in even resource-constrained environments. None of my recommendations for schools have been about some fancy new technology that's going to cost $1 million and take 3 months to do. I'm talking about opening up your windows, putting in a $200 portable air cleaner, right? Wearing a mask. And we can actually do this. And we've tried to demystify the science there. 5 steps for how to do ventilation in a school, really trying to simplify this, because I feel like everywhere we're hitting roadblocks. We can't do it. I'm in an old building. My school can't do this. There's always something you can do to drive down risk, and it doesn't have to be that complicated.
You also noticed that Joe didn't talk about a lot of capital cost. He didn't say ultraviolet ever. He didn't say ionization purifiers ever. I mean, there are lots and lots of vendors, particularly in engineering places, particularly in Scandinavia and in New England, who want to sell you all kinds of stuff. That's not necessarily the answer, and there's not a lot of capital out there. So a lot of what we talk about is balancing all these tools you have, ranging from staying home to wearing masks, these other pieces in between, on a cost-benefit, risk-adjusted basis.
And I think they're very salient points in terms of that we have a public crisis in terms of health, but it's also the economic crisis. And I think exactly that holistic approach is extremely important to bring forward. And just as you're saying, John, it's not so that there are an abundance of resources to go out and buy a lot of fancy equipment. And what I have noticed that you guys are patiently answering a lot of questions on is the aspect of ventilation. Like, you're getting very concrete questions in terms of what kind of ventilation, what is the air quality. We're getting down to where it's the topic, that lovely word in terms of, it's also another heated debate, we'll get into it, but I think it's very, very fascinating to see how that there is an amazing opportunity now also to educate a lot more of us in terms of what does it mean to ventilate. Which filters do we need to ensure in our air conditioning, our ventilation system? We're currently standing in one of the best buildings in Denmark when it comes to ventilation. And yet, when I have seen some of your answers, I'm starting going, okay, are we complying with those recommendations? Question marks. The filtration, you're also being very honest when people are saying it doesn't have to be fancy. This will work. Air purifier, opening your windows. Very, very basic steps and measurements. But as you're saying, Joe, these are something that we can all do. And I'm very happy to see that you are really spreading the words and the recommendations. My question when I was sitting reading and preparing for today, though, is do the average school leadership in terms of managing the school principals, would they know this? Would the average facility manager in a primary school or elementary school, as you would call it, or a secondary, the high school, do they know this? So when you're sending out these very basic, you actually introduced the SMART as well when it came to the schools. Like, what can we do even more to ensure that the facility managers, the school principals, that they are all aware of these very simple tools as you're recommending?
Yeah, it's the critical component here, and we're trying everything, right? You said TV, op-eds, the interviews like this, graphics, the smart graphics, stay home when sick, mask up, air cleaner in every classroom, refresh the indoor air, temporary classrooms, mnemonics, anything we can do to get this message out. We've direct message checklists to superintendents across the different states in the United States. So we're doing everything we can, and to be fair, they haven't had to think about this, right? So this is new, and ventilation can be simple, but if you haven't been thinking about it, well, then it's not so simple, right? So it's the first time you're hearing about it and thinking about it in terms of a disease risk context. But once you demystify it in these kind of conversations, and once we talk to teachers, then they say, oh, I get that. Air changes per hour is intuitive. 1 air change per hour means the full volume of air is exchanged. I get it. 6 air changes means every 10 minutes. I want that. That means we're cleaning the air a lot. So it's not complicated in terms of the concepts, and the doing doesn't have to be all that hard either. So once they hear it and once they get this message, I'm encouraged. A lot of superintendents, school administrators are actually doing it and implementing it. Here's the problem, though. Across the world, we have underinvested in school buildings for decades because we don't think about it. We think about teachers and curriculum, but we don't think that the building is actually influencing student health, student thinking, and student performance. And we wrote another report well before COVID that laid out 200 scientific articles establishing that the school building is playing a critical role in health and learning and thinking. But we've been underinvesting in this space. And in fact, I was at the opening for BLOXHUB a couple of years ago, and I presented just a couple of weeks ago, thanks to Mette Larsen, who invited me to present, and talking about building back better, right? And one thing we have to do is worry about the COVID risk right now. But as we think about our school buildings and other buildings, to be honest, we have to think about what should stay. We shouldn't just bring in more outdoor air for the next 3 or 6 months. That's something that should stay. The plexiglass, yeah, that can go away. But around all of the 9 foundations of a healthy building, we have to start thinking beyond COVID and say, you know what, we need to prioritize our buildings again because it's having such a massive impact on us beyond infectious disease.
John, do you have any comments to that? It is a current discussion, and as you're saying, it's something that you've actually been focusing on pre-COVID. But it's also relevant post-COVID. So let's take, the learnings that we're gathering from now, how to bring that with us, hopefully when we get past COVID, it will pass at some point.
Well, I think there are several, thank you. There are several ways to think about expanding on that. One is around awareness, another is around sensors, and the third is around how do we pay for it. And I'll sort of touch lightly on those, then you can go deeper on any of them if you want to. And I know you have a sequence and you don't want us to just free associate. So with respect to awareness, probably this genie is never going back in the bottle. People are going to be so aware of the risk of this pandemic and future pandemics that this kind of really devastating public health outcome will be on people's minds for a long time. So we won't just be talking about a little bit of mold in the corner and somebody has asthma. We'll be talking about hundreds of thousands of people really at risk. And that will bring people's attention to it. And that's not going to go away in the minds of educators and certainly in the minds of parents. And one of the interesting things about working in the building space is that buildings last a long time. They can last hundreds of years. And it takes a long time to change out the stock. School-age parents turn over pretty quickly. And there's always another group of parents coming in, and you can guarantee that the parents who have school-age kids now are going to be thinking about this all over the world, maybe in Copenhagen, even in Mexico City, that will happen. So that awareness is not going back in the bottle. At the same time, the other thing that's advanced is the ability to do what we're doing right now and really have, notwithstanding that I dropped off for a few minutes a bit ago, having this long-distance conversation, long-distance work, long-distance education. The world has probably advanced 20 years in terms of its capability to use video, whatever, to talk together. So that sort of changes the kinds of things that have to be done together. So that awareness isn't going back in the bottle, and that will probably influence school design for a long time. An aspect of that around how to pay for it is that take the city of New York. They pay for the public schools. They also pay for the public hospitals. So the people going in the emergency room or being on ventilators for 2 weeks are essentially out of the same purse as the school purse. And even though there are different people arguing about this in different segments of a very siloed budget, in the grander scheme, it's quite clear that if more money was spent on having the schools better ventilated and the public housing better ventilated and cleaned and the public transit cleaned, that would have averted a lot of these costs. I don't know if you want to go deeper on that. The second piece is around awareness and sensors. You just said you're in this very big public building. You could have in your hand a personal air quality monitor. There are dozens of these for sale for $100, $100 US dollars, 100 euros, 90 euros, and they'll tell you what the CO2 level is, what the particulates are, what the volatile organic compounds are, what the humidity is, what the temperature is. They can't tell you right now about the presence of coronaviruses, but all those other things I mentioned are a very good proxy for ventilation. So this is really different. So 5 years ago, if you want to know indoor air quality, you had to get a hygienist with a big kit. They'd go to the lab, they'd do the boil stuff for a week, they'd come back and they would tell only the facility manager, and the information was very tightly held. Now individuals can have that. All of you in the room and in every other conference room could be sharing this information, or kids could be going to school with air quality monitors, or apartment renters could have them. And this information is available in the cloud. So there'll be some service like Kayak or TikTok, or not Kayak, or Yelp or Expedia or somebody like that who can tie this together. That might be a way that the democratization of this information influences how people act going forward. So to tie back around to school funding, the awareness is not going away. The ability to measure is here, and the influence of users to say, let's direct our budget a little bit differently. We think it's also going to be how the future of school funding and also commercial real estate funding will start to play out.
And I think it's we're gonna touch upon that really interesting theme of paying for it and the ability of technological devices that are in our hands, so to speak, if we want them to be. So the critique of smart, we'll get back to it, but I think it's really interesting, as you're saying, John, in terms there's also the possibility of individual empowerment. So the awareness is also the brilliant opportunity of educating and learning. And one of the things of learning, I'm getting back to what has been a really heated debate in terms of aerosols. And I'll let you, as the expert, Joe, explain exactly what it is. I'm just going to intro the fact that when we were first introduced to COVID-19, we were told that it would spread through small liquid drops, so we should move away, we should keep a distance, sorry. We called it the social distance. People have actually said it's not a social distance, it's a physical distance, because we should actually move closer to each other socially and psychologically, but there is a physical distance. We were also told that it would be passable or transmittable on a surface. And then you came along, or I certainly heard from you through John that I should look into the argument that it could also spread in other ways. And one of your latest things is that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the States, for those of you who are not aware of this wonderful center, they published with a guidance for the first time, they mentioned aerosols. And then I'll let you tell us what it is. And then they took it down again, right? Did I understand that correctly? And that got you going.
Yeah, they sure did, because it got me going for this simple reason. People need to know this is real so they can protect themselves. And CDC, the US CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, finally acknowledged this was happening just a couple days ago, and then they pulled it down without real explanation. Let me be crystal clear here. Airborne transmission is happening. We have known this since February. I can explain why, some of the science really simply here. And that means we just need to put in some additional controls. The first piece I wrote about the coronavirus was early February in Financial Times, saying that healthy buildings were the first line of defense against this virus, including ventilation and filtration, saying that airborne transmission was happening. The early signs were there. Since that time, every piece of evidence has supported. But let me explain what aerosols and droplets are just really simply. When we talk, sing, breathe, cough, we emit a continuum of particles of different sizes. Some, the very big ones, will settle out within 2 meters or 6 feet. Most will travel beyond 6 feet and stay aloft indefinitely for hours. This is based on basic aerosol physics. The problem has been is that most people have thought, well, it's only the coughing and sneezing, the large particles that do settle out. The reality is most of the virus is concentrated in particles in the 1 to 10 micron range. So that's the size. Those particles can stay aloft for 30 minutes to hours until one of 3 things happens. They're removed from or diluted out of the air through ventilation, they're cleaned out of the air through filtration, or they're absorbed in the lungs. We have to account for all of those if you do indoor air quality modeling around infectious disease. Of course, we want to eliminate the deposition part. Since that time, we've known aerosol, based on aerosol physics, these viral particles travel beyond 6 feet and will stay aloft for hours. We have also detected viral RNA in places that can only be reached through the air, like ductwork. We have a study showing viable virus detected at 16 feet from a patient in a hospital, viable virus. We have case studies showing that when you have low ventilation, people without masks indoors, you have super spreader events, choir outbreaks, outbreaks on a bus, outbreaks in a camp, sometimes in a school, in the Guangzhou, China restaurant example. All of those share the same characteristics. People indoors, no masks, low to no ventilation rate. On top of that, scientists, including my team, have modeled these outbreaks. We published a paper modeling the Diamond Princess cruise ship outbreak and show that 40% of that transmission was aerosol, these fine particles that travel beyond 6 feet. Others have done similar models with the choir practice and others. So we have all of this evidence that shows it's happening. 239 international scientists, myself included, signed a letter to the World Health Organization early July saying airborne transmission is happening. They started to acknowledge it. We have convinced Dr. Fauci in the United States, our top infectious disease expert, who now, I interviewed him at Harvard School of Public Health a couple of weeks ago asking about this. Last week at Harvard Medical School, he said, we got it wrong. Airborne transmission, he says aerosol is counting for a large fraction of the transmission. On top of that, then CDC came out and finally said it. Then mysteriously, they pulled that back. So that's why I'm upset. The science is really clear. And for the average person, this is all it means. You just have to add additional controls. Keep doing hand washing, keep wearing a mask, keep doing the physical distancing, as you say, but now just add in ventilation and filtration. Open up your windows, portable air cleaners, and we need to get that message out. It actually strengthens the message that masks are critically important. And so I had an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday talking about this CDC mistake, the withdrawal of this information from the public. They're getting the science wrong.
And I think that's a very, very critical fact to get across. They're getting the science wrong, and it is airborne. It also led to people asking you, is it safe to fly? And you actually then responded, it is, as you have already said, there is a risk there's a risk in anything. That's part of life. But you also documented that the ventilation and filtration used on an airplane, if it's following standard, it is of minimum risk. Is that correctly understood on my part?
It is, and let's be clear. So yeah, again, it comes down to these principles. So the airplane gets 10, 12, sometimes more air changes per hour. Everything runs through a HEPA filter. Can you get sick on an airplane? Yeah, it can happen. It can happen anywhere. Are the risks low? Yeah, certainly. We have 1 or 2 case studies showing it might be happening. But just in the US, we had 7 million people travel last week. So people are sometimes forgetting the denominator. It's kind of like when an airplane crash happens. It's front page news, and it should be, because we can learn from it. Does it mean flying is not safe? No. It's one of millions of trips. Same thing here. And it just comes down to that ventilation filtration question, right? And the masking is definitely happening. In fact, the science that shows that 1 or 2 case studies might be happening on an airplane were when people weren't wearing masks on an airplane. So that really needs to happen. I do want to be clear about one thing on airplanes, though. They are important vectors for disease spread, right? As someone gets on a plane in Denmark, comes to the US, or vice versa, or within a country, one sick person can seed outbreaks. So I still don't think everybody should just jump back on a plane tomorrow. If you need to travel, you can do it, and you have to take the precautions. Doesn't mean you do the way it used to do it. You wear a mask and you're extra careful, washing your hands more frequently. But yeah, I think it's overemphasized. I think people mistakenly think that the airplane is a super high risk environment when you're sitting in that airplane. It turns out it's the lowest risk, in my perspective, throughout the whole travel experience. It's the lowest risk.
Right, because you might be queuing up in the jetway, you might be queuing up in the baggage claim, you might be queuing up with people at the coffee shop. Probably more dangerous than sitting in the plane.
That's a very good point. We are moving on to that wonderful, and that's getting back to your salient points as well, John, in terms of the smart city, smart building, and smart centers. And there is in the New Yorker article, I actually thought it was very interesting. I also read that. And we're getting into the discussion now of the empowerment versus the ethical dilemmas, because I think what we're getting here from this wonderful talk is the trying to convey the message that once we listen to science, we're able to also live our lives. So science can actually aid us in living lives and becoming more comfortable in managing the risks that are a natural part of life. I'm just going to read out from the article in the New Yorker, because this is going back to the smart cities, smart buildings, and sensors. Building design is also increasingly driven by personal data collected and held as a commodity and used to improve business performance and productivity. Ethical objections to this type of data collection suspended during the pandemic are unlikely to recover their strength when it's over, which means that if you ever go back to the office, you may be monitored in ways you used to consider a violation of your rights. I think it's a very, because typically when I've had previous talks about smart city, smart buildings, I've looked into these projects and the research where they're basically kind of being highly critical of what does it mean. And we won't go in, but I think it's the ethical dilemmas versus that empowerment that you touched upon, John, that there is no going back to saying this is an oversight. This can actually be a tool for us to use. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, John.
Of course I want to elaborate on that. This sort of fundamental issue of security versus freedom is part of the course of human history. It's also in the infrastructure space, the idea of optimization versus individual agency is a big issue as well. So if you think of trying to optimize transportation systems or water systems at some central level, you can do that, but then you have to tell people when they can ride the subway, when they can use electricity, when they can use water. So you get these benefits from optimization that comes with trade-offs in individual liberty or individual license. I've described the censor's question in real estate groups in a couple different ways. So one is you can imagine, as I described, a group of citizens or individuals saying, yes, here's how we are reporting out into some democratic cloud in an open data context where I am and what the air is right now. You're seeing this right now in the American West and outdoor air quality. People are using a variety of services to share what the particulates are, which have been huge, and what the air quality is during the fires. This could be very democratized. Add to that the new Apple Watch 6. That not only has all the normal stuff that you'd expect in a smartwatch, it also has a blood oxygenation monitor, pulse monitor, temperature monitor, things like this. So if you want to, if you elect to, you can tie in your personal physical data with the data in the build and in the air. You can imagine this being a very democratically wonderful thing, adding to a lot of choice. Or you can imagine, say, a big commercial landlord saying, you know, I'm going to have we're a real estate investment trust. We have 2 billion square feet of space. We want to make sure that our tenants believe this is the absolute safest brand of any real estate investment trust in the world. So we are going to give you an Apple Watch or a Fitbit when you walk in the door. We're going to take your temperature when you come in. We're going to do thermal monitoring of you in the elevator, and we're going to have you fill out a survey every day about how you feel and did your colleagues sneeze on you and were people too close at the salad bar. And we're going to impose this in all our buildings, and our tenants are going to love it because now it's safe to go back to work. Or you can imagine a school system doing that. It doesn't take much to say you can imagine a government doing that and saying, you know, we're going to go and monitor all these pieces, which essentially is how they beat the virus down in places where there's so less objection to that kind of thing, like Singapore or South Korea or China. And you see obvious benefits. The really obvious benefits to society from those kind of controls and optimizations. There are also really obvious costs in freedom and individual license to move. And I think that is going to exacerbate the same questions we've always had about smart cities. But the smart city question before was, is my phone just saying where I am? Like, I'm already freaked out just about location tracking. And my kids are I have kids in their 20s. One says the game is totally over, everything's out there, it's all revealed. The other kid takes the battery out, uses virtual private networks, it's not any social networks. So they're on both aspects of that. So there isn't really an answer, but now add to this, I'm going to bleed into the next piece about who pays for this stuff, if I may. So no governments are going to have any money in the near future because they're spending so much on COVID, and so we haven't even talked about this horrible economic recession, and there are still 30 million Americans out of work. And the United States, we think that the white-collar recession is just starting, the layoffs are just starting. So that is happening. No governments will have any money. In the United States, individual states generally have to have balanced budgets every year. They can't print their own money. That means they have to lay off teachers, policemen, close transit systems. Where could the money come from? There's also, at least in the United States, a very large health insurance industry, and one of the largest pharmacy chains, CVS, also owns one of the largest health insurance companies, Aetna. You could imagine CVS Aetna saying, you know, we want to keep people healthy. We know what you're buying in the pharmacy because we have your credit card receipts. If you want, you can let us opt in to read your phone when you come in and see what your personal data is, and we will go ahead and pay for the upfront cost for your employer to do the capital improvements that Joe is talking about to keep everybody healthier. In a benign world, cool, this is great. Everybody's healthier and the costs get paid for. In a malicious world, this is not good. So somewhere there is going to be that balance in that regard. My personal hope, obviously, is that the information gets democratized and the individual users get to work together to say, you know, this office building is pretty good, this apartment building is pretty good, the school is pretty good, and that buyer momentum will influence the providers to respond accordingly.
I think that's a very good, again, a good point. I noticed, and I can't remember now the time frame, but certainly you had some of your very, very, very large companies that withdrew their advertising on Facebook. So that constructive dialogue with Facebook, when we're talking, now I'm going into the theme in terms of democratization and the benign, if you like, to kind of, there's also a push factor within some of these mechanisms that some of these large companies that withdrew their marketing, it actually had an effect. So, I mean, there are various actors here, and we'll dive into that shortly. I just find it very, very interesting in terms of, as you're saying as well, that there is a lot of opportunities here, but we're also facing and looking into a recession. You feel it, you're able to, you see it very, very vividly in the States. In Denmark, we're so privileged that we're able to mitigate some of the harsh consequences of this pandemic. And I don't think I say too much to say that in the Nordic countries, we're quite grateful for that mitigation because it has softened the blow, as it were. But when it comes to the way forward and how we're going to increase the personal data, my question to you, Joe, is that would also require, again, the awareness. We cannot put the awareness, we cannot put it back in the bottle, as you said, John, but we still need that kind of what you're able to do with your research team, Joe, those very simple recommendations that we can understand. You had the SMART, where one of if I remember, the S was for the social distance and the M was for the mask, if I remember correctly, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, it's a really good point because we see this in the market right now, right? That the democratization of data might already be happening, but I actually think what you're also seeing too is that it's data overload. Look, you can put this cheap air sensor in your house, your office, and what are you going to do with a CO2 reading every 5 seconds? You know, and most people have no idea what to do. So there's that other layer that has to be there, really, that says, well, we can measure what we do, but who interprets what's real? You know, if I say 800 parts per million of CO2, I know what that means. If I say 1 part per million of formaldehyde, I know what that means. Most people, well, you know, is that good, bad? What do I do about it, right? And so I think that's the stage right now. There's a million companies, not quite a million, with these air sensors throwing data at people, and then people say, well, now what? What do I do? So there's that next stage that will be happening in the sensor revolution. And it's really the merging of smart buildings with healthy buildings. Yeah. You know, smart buildings are great, but to what end? Well, to my end of interest is towards health. And so you have to take those data streams, process them and say, you know what? You're meeting the occupational limit, good. You're meeting the screening levels, good. Are you hitting the optimal target? And that's where the real, I think, the public health revolution, or this healthy buildings revolution that's happening, taking us from green buildings to healthy buildings with the smart technology overlay, that's where it gets really powerful. And in fact, it'd be nice when we get to the point, and we're headed there, companies are already doing this, where the building starts responding autonomously. Not, I get a message on my phone that says, okay, I'm out of balance. What do I do? Well, I go to the thermostat, I open the window. No, the building just says, something's not quite right here. Bring in more outdoor air, increase filtration, right? And we're doing this. This is happening, and this is coming, and that's where it's, you know, we don't have to think about it anymore, and that's what will be the real, you know, exciting part of the merger of smart buildings with healthy buildings when it becomes autonomous, truly autonomous.
And I think it's that
I should point out a little blind spot that we all have in this regard around smart and healthy buildings, though, which is that we're talking about ventilation. Like a third of the people in the world live in homes that don't even really have windows. Ventilation isn't an issue. Water is an issue, and sanitation is an issue. There are also most of the jobs in the developed world aren't jobs that people like us can do remotely from our house. They're jobs where you go to meet packing plant or the hospital or the home care thing or the bus driver thing. And those people have been really disproportionately affected. So it's a little bit of a techno dream to be thinking about the stuff that the elite people are going to do to make themselves more elite without thinking about what we do, particularly in something like COVID-19 that is so disproportionately hurt poor people, and the United States hurt people of color for a number of reasons. So that overlays for us with the heightened heightened awareness of racial injustice that's been happening this summer, layered on with COVID, layered on with an economic recession, even if you put aside the rest of the political climate.
I think this is a very beautiful bridge to the topic of public health, public infrastructure, and private capital, just as you've both touched upon. And because I think you're absolutely right, the inequality that we're also seeing is pervasive. And let's not forget there is biodiversity, there are climate changes going on, and we also have a lot of people who are not able to be inside healthy buildings. I just read about a refugee camp where there are an obscene amount of people that have 3 sources of water. So it's. I think you're right, John. Let's not forget that. With the pandemic, we've seen so many different strategies. We've touched on Singapore. We've touched on South Korea. We also have Iceland in the Nordic countries that we're looking at. We have different strategies. Certainly, you're witnessing that much more than we are, because you, without being impolite, the national strategy may be slightly vague, but you have had some more regional strategies that have had very, very different stances. The ways in which public health has been administered are discussed even in this country where we are extremely privileged. We know this. In Denmark, it has been debated quite heatedly whether we had actually ensured an infrastructure pre-COVID that was able to deal with COVID-19. So in the first few months, there was a lot of criticism that we were actually not able to deal with COVID-19 due to the lack of this public infrastructure. And we actually witnessed private capital, private companies that secured the logistical flow of PPE to make sure that our health staff was protected, because that was actually the situation, that we did not have the test capacities and we did not have enough PPE. For all of you watching and joining us, PPE is personal protection equipment that is needed for the health staff. From your perspective, what has COVID-19 demonstrated with regards to that kind of urge or the need for collaboration when it comes to public health? You're the expert in public health, Joe. The public infrastructure and private capital, as you keep pointing out, John, the governments do not have any money. We need some way of addressing these aspects as well. What is your perspective on this urgent need? John, you get to go first.
George. Okay.
I'd say you go first. I mean, this is right in your wheelhouse.
Sure. So, since I teach in a business school, a lot of what I teach about is what can business get done without necessarily having to wait for government to do X, Y, Z thing. Like, it's easy to say, oh goodness, we have all this growth, we have all these people, and therefore the government should tax us properly, and using good cost-benefit analysis and project prioritization, spend our tax money wisely for the infrastructure that we all need, which actually happens in Denmark and Netherlands and Singapore and a few other places, not so much elsewhere. So I have a lot of students who are in the government school, and I say, good, you go ahead and worry about that. In the meantime, where can the private sector step in? So I'll give you an example of private finance of what might be thought of as public infrastructure. In Mexico City, the water is almost free for all 22 million residents. However, the water very seldom flows. So particularly out to the far neighborhood, the Delegaciones, and today in the New York Times they were talking about Iztapalapa, which doesn't have water and has one of the worst COVID instances in the world. There are a number of companies that can provide various levels of water and sanitation on a privatized basis on sort of a pay-for-you-go kind of angle. In Mexico City, it generally costs about the tariff for water, if you pay for it, is about 2 pesos. The variable cost is about 20 per 1,000 liters, and the all-in cost is about 40 per 1,000 liters because the water has to be pumped 1,000 kilometers from Lerma and Cutzamala up to Mexico City. So the city is losing 38 pesos per 1,000 liters. In the meantime, privatizers say, we can provide you a privatized water service for maybe 20 or 25, and now you'll only lose 18 and it'll be good. But people complain about the price of this. So in the meantime, what happens? Everybody buys bottled water, like everybody, 90% of people in Mexico City. The bottled water has its own infrastructure, including all the bottles and all the trucks. And the trucks go out to all the neighborhoods, create traffic, destroy the roads. People use a bottle one time and the bottle goes in the drain and clogs the drain, so then floods happen. So this cycle happens over and over again. And what we're working with is companies to say, we'll provide actual fresh water for the people, and the government can say they're doing it, but the government will pay us our cost, which is actually less than the government cost, and that will bring this private capital in because we have this water purchase agreement, which is financeable. And that would be the way to accomplish this and accomplish that health benefit. The obstacle that comes up is A, the government says, no, we want to provide it ourselves, and B, water is a human right, it should be free. Okay, it should be free, but if you don't get it, like what good does that do, like the example you gave before? So a lot of what I'm interested in is how the situation can be improved from the actual observed on the ground status quo using some of these private kind of means.
Joe, what is? I assume that you agree with John, but yeah.
Yeah, and I tell you, it speaks to a new initiative we're launching at my school, School of Public Health. John's involved in this. My dean calls it when public health means business. This is really about, public health. It's our moment, but we're not solely responsible for defining what comes next. In fact, it'll never work if that's the case. Business can't do it alone either. The future here is really about partnerships, and I'm a firm believer. I mean, look what John and I are doing. It's about partnerships in different disciplines and bringing along the private sector. And importantly, I like the principles of public health. It's about equity. It's, of course, grounded in health and sustainability. So it's a great lens for businesses to take. And really, so we're kind of not hopeful, this is really how it has to happen, is to define this path together. I'm a commissioner on the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. I chair the task force on safe work, safe schools, and safe travel. On the task force, John Macomber, CEOs from the business world. I did not build the task force to say, I'm just going to pull in, 10 academics and we're going to talk to each other like we always do. No, we're connecting to the business world, the business community to say, how do we take public health science and turn that into practical solutions?
Touched upon that earlier in our conversation, that the current standards are of minimum rather where they actually should be of optimum. And you are staunch advocates of a national standard. Like that's also some of the things that you've talked about in terms of the public health, that the public infrastructure, if we have a set of national standards, that way we also know what to work towards and based on. I assume that is also what you're bringing into the task force?
Absolutely. And, John mentioned it a little earlier. We talk a lot about ventilation. So clearly ventilation matters for cognitive function. We mentioned that. Infectious disease transmission, not just for COVID, sick building syndrome. But if you look at the standard that sets the standard for ventilation everywhere across the world, it's set by a standard setting body called ASHRAE. Every architect, engineer would be familiar with ASHRAE. The name of the standard is the Standard for Acceptable Indoor Air Quality. Acceptable. Right? It's a minimum standard. Yet we design every single space we work in, learn in, teach in, play in, heal, recover in, on these minimum standards. It doesn't make sense to me. For 40 years, we have all of this research that says, the minimum standards are the minimum, to the bare functioning of an indoor space we design our buildings to. But all the science says when we go above that minimum, we see all of these benefits. I mean, and if you look at the standard, for ventilation, what it's actually trying to do? It's really about odor control and the bare minimum of indoor air quality. And by odor, I mean, you have a conference room with 10 people in it. The 11th person shows up a half hour late. You want to be sure they don't come in and say, hey, it doesn't quite smell right in here. I'm out of here. Really, it's a bare minimum standard, and largely around odor control is the truth. But we treat it as code, that it's healthy. It's not a healthy standard. By name, it's an acceptable standard. We need to go well beyond acceptable going forward.
Yes.
Those standards are also based on much earlier measurements. So it was easy to measure temperature and humidity. So that's generally what they talk about, and they're often a comfort kind of standard or a subjective standard like odor control. So in the ensuing 20 or 30 years, when it's impossible to measure certainly CO2 and also volatile organic compounds and particulates, that hasn't been adopted in this. So some of the challenges in early green buildings were people saying, let's only bring in outside air when the CO2 measurement is a problem. And that didn't jibe with most building codes. That wasn't how they were written. And so people had to over-design buildings. And in the green building space, there's been a lot of pushback against having to over-design because people were looking, the codes were looking at very strict construction standards and not measuring live performance and continuous commissioning. And we don't have time for it today, but Joe and I have written a lot about what the standards for well buildings ought to be, or for healthy buildings ought to be, whether it's well, fit well, BREEAM, LEED, something else, and the kind of ways in which the health performance indicators that you asked me about an hour ago apply on a continuous commissioning basis, not just a set of points around some design. So there's a lot around those standards to be upgraded. And a lot of that will be driven, in our view, by schools and hospitals and the private sector, because the governments won't get around to doing it. But the next layer in that is, for me in the commercial world, is things are often driven by insurance companies and banks. And if banks start to worry about liability around some of these buildings not being healthy and don't want to extend the mortgage, that will de facto mean that a lot of this gets installed anyway, kind of how fire protection and sprinklers wound up coming into high-rise buildings in much of the world because they couldn't get commercial mortgages without them.
And I think that ties beautifully back to what Joe is also witnessing, that you have principals, you have school administrations that are really eagerly wanting to become not just aware, but also knowledgeable and applying those recommendations. So I think you're touching upon again, you would think that we had coordinated it. We didn't. But the last topic is actually the pay for performance. And I think you just touched upon it, John. And I think the collaboration between you guys is a testament to what some of us see as the future business model, that the incentive and the impact investment is pay for based on success, like performance indicators. We have about 1 minute left before I have to say the polite goodbyes. I've brought in the questions that I've received throughout. But I'd like you to take the perspective, do you, based on everything that you have gone through the last few months, and you've been really, really busy, do you see a new business model emerging when it comes to healthy buildings and construction and healthy cities?
I'll go first, and Joe, you can have last word. It's early days, but yes, because we're certainly seeing it in all aspects of sort of top-end commercial real estate. The healthy buildings are getting the tenants, and the healthy buildings are getting the premiums. The less healthy buildings are vacant. And everywhere you look, someone wants to say, my restaurant is cleaner than your restaurant, my hotel is cleaner than your hotel, my store is cleaner than your store, and that will continue.
Joe?
Yeah, I'll add one last thought. John and I share this common goal that, it's good. We shouldn't be competing on health. Healthy buildings should just be the norm, not this exception. You shouldn't have to choose an airline based on which one's healthier or safer or which hotel. It just should be what happens. I am encouraged that, when we started writing the book, certainly we felt passionately about this. We interview top experts who were along this journey with us. But really, there were a handful of organizations talking about healthy buildings prior to COVID. Now you've seen an explosion of interest in this topic. major Fortune 100 companies have stood up divisions focused on healthy buildings, building out new products, senior executives who are now the executive in charge of healthy building, the Healthy Buildings Program. So you're seeing this both on the supply side and the demand side too. People are rethinking about their leases. I've been contacted and people saying, I don't think we've been asking the right questions about our leases. What are the questions we should ask about a healthy building? And so the whole game is going to be changed because the tenants are asking those questions, because the employees won't go back to anything but a healthy building. Who would? Now the landlords are coming and even talking to John and I saying, well, we need a healthy building strategy. The employees demanding it, the tenants demanding it, and then the manufacturing supply chain saying, hey, we have solutions here. So you've seen the market shift remarkably quick and in a good way since March. Now we just have to make sure that extends to everybody, as John said, not just these, the big players in the top cities like Copenhagen, New York, Boston. No, it has to be everywhere.
Yeah. And with that, I'm going to say a huge thank you. It has been brilliant, formidable, and such a huge pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you while you're in Boston and we're standing here in the Copenhagen studio. I can't thank you enough, and thank you for all of those of you out there participating and watching and that have been joining us today. It has just been really, really such a huge pleasure. We hope that you've learned much more about healthy buildings and also aerosols than you expected when you joined us. Listen, guys, a huge thank you, and I look forward to seeing you. Were you here, we'd go out in sunny Copenhagen and have a drink. But I know it's actually early in the day, so you have to go to work. I know that. But listen, thank you very, very much. Really, thank you.
Thank you for having us.